Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Cherwell acquired by Avanti technical deep dive. This one is about APIs and webhooks with a focus on how to create a more powerful system with APIs and webhooks that you can leverage across the entire enterprise. My name is Tabitha Ishman, and I'm the marketing manager of Excalibur Data Systems. I wanted to welcome you all again for spending some of your afternoon or morning or whatever time it is for you with us today and talk about a few logistics before we go ahead and get started. The lines are muted and the webinar is being recorded. A recording will be sent via email to all participants on Monday. We'll answer questions at the end in a Q&A session, but just note that we will stay on the line past the 1 hour mark to answer some additional questions. You can feel free to ask questions at any time during the presentation just by typing them into the question window. An added note is that we will provide a resource slide with some links to find supporting information from the presentation, and I'll make sure to attach that to the follow-up email. Now, just a little bit about Excalibur Data Systems. We are a leading edge consulting firm guiding organizations through their digital transformation journey. We work with strategic partners and leverage best of breed enterprise service management technologies. And I know we have a lot of great content to get to today. So to kick us off, I'd like to introduce Greg Woodruff, Senior Solution Architect and Consultant at Excalibur Data Systems. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Tabitha. Good afternoon and good morning to those fellow West Coasters. My name is Greg Woodruff. I am a consultant with Excalibur Data Systems. I've been a consultant with them for about 1.5 years, but I've been working with Cherwell for over 5 years now. But my background goes back 30 plus years in the IT realm. I've worn many hats, but I guess my areas of expertise have been .NET software development, relational databases, particularly SQL Server and data migrations and IP integrations, all those kinds of fun things. I enjoy troubleshooting and problem solving, so those are kind of my areas of fun outside of outside of anything else that's more exciting than that. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Scott Valler.
Thanks, Greg. I'm Scott Valler, Senior Solutions Architect and Consultant with Excalibur. I have been using Cherwell 10 plus years. I started out as an admin at a customer site, moved my way into consulting. Oh God, this December it'll be 6 years now I've been doing this. It's amazing. I've been in IT for more than 26 years. I'm a mechanical engineer, and most of my life in IT has been spent in the infrastructure side, everything from small organizations up to Fortune 500 international companies directing IT across the entire Americas. So broad spectrum of experience in just about every industry you can think of we've touched. And I just enjoy helping people find solutions and sharing the knowledge about Cherwell. It's always a fun tool. So I'm really glad that you guys were able to take time and join us. So we're going to have a really great presentation for you. And what we're going to cover today are these topics, and hopefully we're going to give you a good insight as to how you set up, use, and work your way through the API. We have a really great example of how to leverage the API, just to give you some brain food on some different ways you can utilize it. A little kind of off the beaten path example here. It's one of my favorites that we're going to put together. We're going to move fairly quickly. The nice thing is everything we're going to do, we're going to show it so that you've got it in the video so you can pause and go back and look at all of the fields and how we put things together. So if we're going a little fast, that's okay, because it will definitely be available for you to go back and look at. All right, so pretty much everything we're going to do from here on out is going to be live in the tools so that you can see where we do stuff and how we get there. All right. I'm using Cherwell 10.2.1 today for my examples, and I'm in the admin tool right now. In order to use the API, so just give you a kind of a way we're going to work this is I'm going to go through and show you how you set stuff up, how you kind of learn about it, and then Greg's going to walk us through physically utilizing it, and then I'll pick up the webhook stuff at the end here, just to give you a general agenda flow. When you get started, the first thing you've got to do is set up the API and get a user created and have everything configured so it's usable. So the first thing you need to do is go ahead and create a user. In this case, I have created an API example user. I personally like to make a new user account for each integration that I do. That way I have control and I can enable and disable the accounts. And I also know who's doing what because it shows who took those actions. And so I can tell what system is interacting with my Cherwell system. I don't like to use a blanket account. The other thing that I do around my API accounts is I tend to make a custom security group for each of these API accounts and use the least access model where I only provide access within that security group to the things they need to touch. So I've got an API example security group, and within the business objects, what do they need to do? So, maybe they're editing approvals. Can they view them, edit them, etc.? So keep your permissions very tight and limited would be my suggestion so that that API can only touch what it's supposed to touch. And that will also catch unexpected off-brand usages of your API accounts. When they go, I've already got it, I don't want to bug you for another account, and they start trying to do something that they're not authorized to, that'll help you keep that under control a little bit. So you've got to set up basically a security group and a user account. If it needs team membership, go ahead and do that. Usually doesn't when you're dealing with the API, but if that's the case, deal with that. The next thing you have to do here under security is come over here to the Edit REST API Client Settings. You have to set up a new client connection. So for every integration that you're doing, it's a good idea to set up one of these. And you'll give it a name, set up a culture for it. When you create it, it's going to generate a read-only client key. And that's unique to this particular endpoint integration that we're doing. So when I connect as Widget Factory here, I'm going to have to use this client key, and we'll show you where you use that for your authentication. Keep in mind that the culture, if you're doing different cultures, you'll have to create different integrations per culture. That will help you make things a little bit easier. When it comes to the client key, one thing I did want to point out is the client key, because it's read-only, is going to be unique per environment. So if I set this up in dev, I'm going to get this client key. Great. When I go to prod, since this isn't part of a blueprint, I'll have to recreate the REST API interface here. I'm going to get a whole new client key. One way to deal with that is to store the client keys in a stored value and use the stored value within your one-steps. That way, as you move between environments, you can update the stored client key and your one-steps don't break. Then eventually, when you do a lower environment refresh from prod, they're all going to synchronize over time, and you'll be okay. Another option that you have up here is if you want to, you can always tell it to regenerate the client key. Blow that one away, get a new one. So if that key's been compromised or you just want a new key for some reason, that's how you would do that. The next thing you run into here is the token lifespan. The default's 20 minutes. You can increase this. That's how long is the authorization token that I get when I first get authorized, how long is that valid for so that I don't have to get another token? If you increase this lifespan, you must go change the timeouts on the API application pool in IIS, because if my token lifespan exceeds the timeout on the API application pool and the application pool times out and goes dead, the session ID that I have in that app pool is going to go away, and when the app pool spins back up, it's going to generate a new session ID, and my token will now be invalid because it was generated based off of my session ID. So if those are out of sync, you're going to get screwed at some point whenever that timeout happens, and you're going to expect your token to be valid. So pay attention to that. As far as your refresh token, how long is it good for to be able to reuse to go grab a new token? You can set that here. And then you have this API access is enabled. So I can enable or disable this without having to get rid of it. So I can just turn it off temporarily. And then, does this allow anonymous access for read-only without username and password, or do I have to force a username and password? That's pretty much what you're looking at there. So that's the next step. After I have set up my user account, my security group, I've got my API set up, then the next thing that I want to look at is, excuse me, I didn't mean to close the dialog box. I have to set up the API URL. So when you do an upgrade or an install, it asks you to configure this. So you're just checking to make sure that this is configured correctly for your environment. This is the base URL for the API. And so this is where you're going to grab this when you're setting up your calls to the API. That's the base. And we'll show you how you utilize that as well. Additionally, later when I talk about webhooks, this is also the base portion that the webhooks are built off of. And so you'll have to come and make sure that this API URL is set correctly for webhooks to function. And when we talk about webhooks, here within the API URL settings, you also have one additional piece that's unique to webhooks for when we get to that point later, and that is the maximum size of the payload. So when I do a webhook, I usually am pushing in a JSON or an XML package, and how big can that be? So if I need to increase this size, then I'd have to bump that up. So that's where you would find those two settings. Okay. So that takes care of all of that. And then the next thing that we talk about, at this point, you have everything configured. I can start using the API. So how do I find out about the API? What do I find for documentation? How do I use it? I'm going to grab my client key right here, copy that onto the clipboard, and I'm going to show you how you can get some documentation around the API. There's two levels, and I'm going to show you the first and then the second. The first here is if I go to the server, so your say your excalibur.cherwellondemand.com, put that here and then do /Cherwell API, and that will automatically take me to the Swagger page. Swagger is a self-documenting tool that Cherwell has incorporated that will document all of the API interfaces, show you how to use them, as well as let you test them without having to write any code. So whenever I'm getting started with a new API that I'm testing out or going to work with, I always hit Swagger first. It gives me a super easy way to play with it without ever touching any code. So to use Swagger, you have to have that client ID that I just copied from where I was setting up the REST API. So this is unique to that one connection that I'd set up for the widget factory. And I just paste it here. And then the way that this works is you have groups. So we've got stuff around approvals, business objects, whatever you want. Let's go look at teams, because I want to use that as my example. When I expand teams, I get a variety of different API endpoints here. So I've got one for add user to team by batch, add just a user to a single team, add user to team. You'll notice there's two of them. So there's API version 1 for add user to team, and then there's API version 2 for add user to team. So Cherwell has written an additional version of the add user to team API, and they did not deprecate the original. They left it in place, and they created a new version. And so if I were to use this version 1, I'd have to define this entire endpoint. I'd have to say the URL /API/v1 add user to team versus v2. And they do that because they don't want to break anything. So Cherwell, just as they put out new versions, they increment the version for that API interface. All right, and you'll notice there's three types. There's post, where I'm pushing data into Cherwell. There's delete, which is just what it says. I'm going to delete a record. And get, where I'm pulling stuff out of Cherwell. I'm retrieving data. So I'm going to go ahead and just as an example, I'm going to go ahead and say get teams here. And it kind of tells us, well, what does it do? It's going to get us the ID and name for all the available teams. And how's the data going to come? Well, here's what the response is going to look like. It's going to be in this case, I'm getting a JSON response. It's teams, and I'm getting an array that lists the team ID and the team name, and then another record with the team ID and the team name, and the results. Was there an error? What's the result code? Basic output. I have some parameters down here. If I wanted to, I could specify a locale or a language in order to get the response back formatted in that language. And I got a tryout button, which if I click that, it's basically gonna want to try to make me sign in. All right, so if you look up here to the right though, I have an on and off. It does the same thing. So if you just pop this on, it's gonna ask me to authenticate now because I've put that client, that URL string up above, the client ID. And now I need to use the user account that I created just for the API to log in. And if you use that account here, you can easily test it and make sure that you have the right permissions to do stuff, as well as maybe test it to make sure it doesn't have permissions if you're having a struggle there with the, excuse me, with the security group settings. I apologize, my throat is really scratchy today. It's crazy. So up here, you'll see it's on. So I'm authenticated right now. So I can use anything in the API right now and play with it as that API example user, and I'm good to go. So if I come down here and try this out again, I now get some results. I get this curl example, and this is where it's showing how I could use curl to send this command and all of the data that would be in that command, as well as here is the URL that it was sent to. So in my code, I could use that URL when I'm getting ready to say I'm using PowerShell. That's my base URL that I'm going to send the API request to. And then here's the response. And I said I was going to get a JSON array. So here's my teams array. And then here's each team. And I'm good to go. And there, I'm using out of the box demo content. So that's all the teams that are there. I got a response code. I got a 200 series response, which means I was successful. And it doesn't always have to be 200. It could be 201 or any of the other valid 200 responses for success. And then here's the header. All right. So that's getting some data. If I want to push some data in, let's go ahead and do a post. Let's go ahead and see here. Let's do add users to team by batch. So let's see what, there's a little difference with these. Again, it tells me what I'm doing. I'm still authenticated. Shows me what the response is going to look like. Basically, I'm going to get a bunch of responses for each team that I'm going to add to. I'm just going to get a, was I successful for that team and this team and the next one, etc., as well as an overall response. But this one has some data that I have to send in. It's asking for the request parameters. I have to send those in. Okay, what's that look like? Well, if you look over here to the right, it shows you an example of how you would build the JSON package you have to send. And if you just click it, it adds it in over here. If you want to just start typing, you could replace these values right there. Or in this case, I have already pre-built my JSON package to put myself into 2 teams. So I could just say, I don't want to use that. I want to use what's already written and paste that in and give it a whirl. All right, so here is the curl, and there's that JSON data. There's the URL. I didn't get a response, and I got a 400 code, which means I got an error. So something went wrong, okay? I expected that, by the way, because I wanted to show you kind of what happens when it goes wrong. When it goes wrong, you get this 400 error. It doesn't always tell you exactly what went wrong. And what I have found over the years is I tend to make typing mistakes more often than I make data mistakes. So the first thing that I always do is I validate, I'm just gonna copy that back on the clipboard, is I validate that my JSON is valid, that I haven't made a mistake in the structure of the JSON. There are a ton of JSON validators out there. I like this one personally, but there's tons of them. And basically I just paste in my JSON here And I can click the validate button, but I'm on the validate page, so it auto validates. And right over here, it's telling me what's wrong. Line 7, it's expecting basically an end of line or some other separator. So I forgot the comma in my array, basically. So let's pop back over to Swagger and paste the fixed one in and run it through. Okay, let's see what we get. So I got a response code of 200. So the API call was successful in the sense that it talked to the API and the transaction went through. But to find out if the transaction itself individually was successful, I have to look at the response. And so within my response, you'll see that I have errors. I have a bad user. I didn't get the right rec ID. So it still didn't add the user, but I was successful in talking to the API. So I have a totally different problem. I don't have an API issue. I just copied the wrong ID issue. But those are some of the troubleshooting steps you'll want to run through as you're trying to work with the API and test stuff out and kind of work your way through the layers. And hopefully the validator will save you some frustration, because I regularly will make a mistake like that. And trying to look through it by hand is a waste of time, half the time if it's a large or JSON package. All right, so that is how Cherwell documents the API for you. They're all over the place here. Just kind of look through and see what you can do and play with them a little bit, have some fun with them. And then once you figure out what you want to do, then here in a minute, I'm gonna hand it off to Greg, and he's gonna show you how you actually implement those things in a variety of options and different tools. The other piece I told you is that there's a second piece of documentation. Here on the Swagger page, there's a link right up here that's going to take you out to the Cherwell help site and give you full documentation on the API. It's going to talk about the different types of authentication, whether you're using a SAML or OAuth 2, or you're using standard basic username and password authentication that we're going to show you. It has deep examples on troubleshooting, how to set up all the stuff I've already shown you. There's great documentation there. So easiest way to find it is just pop right through here. Okay, so that's all the foundational stuff, and I'm gonna hand it off to Greg now. I'm gonna make him the presenter, so give us just a sec while we flip this over. Make Greg the presenter, there we go. And then that'll give Greg a chance to pop in and show you guys how we actually build out and utilize the API within Cherwell in some great examples.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep, I am seeing your Swagger screen.
Okay, perfect. Yes, thank you, Scott. So what I wanted to do first was, I mean, there are a variety of tools out there that you can use to test APIs. The Swagger is an excellent tool for the Cherwell API. It's got everything there you can use to test with, and all the different functionality. But one other tool I wanted to show you, which is quite popular, is Postman. And I use Postman a lot myself when I'm doing not only with Cherwell, the API, but I'm also integrating with Salesforce and other tools. And this gives me an excellent tool to test those with as well. So I wanted to show you the download page. It's a free download. Just go to postman.com downloads, download the app, and you get started right away. And it's very, very simple to use. So I already have it installed on my machine, so I just wanted to show you how I would set it up to test the Cherwell API. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the token so that we can be authenticated, and then from there we can try all the other operations that we need. So the first thing we need to do is to set up our post, and I have my URL in here, which is what Scott had showed you earlier. We have our base Cherwell API, and it's simply the endpoint is just to add token onto the end of it. We're going to do a post method, so that means we're going to be actually sending some kind of a body to the API, and this gives us in Postman, it gives us a real easy way to set up the body here. So you can set up parameters the authentication, you can look at the headers, but for setting up the body, in this particular case, the type is a form URL encoded body, as opposed to sending like a full JSON package. So we can set up, and I'll show you further how we do that within Cherwell, but I just wanted to give you an idea how to test that here in Postman. So we create our 5 different types that we need that we're going to pass in the request. So we have our grant type, which is always going to be hard-coded to password. We have our username and password, which is like Scott had showed you. This is the account that I've set up to use for my API. So I just need to specify the username and password. The client ID is that GUID that Scott had showed you, or that we create for the REST API. And then the last one is the auth mode. And this, in this case, is going to be internal because I'm using just an internal Cherwell account to do my authentication. And once I've set those parameters up, you'll see if I go look at the headers, it already adds in a content type with this application form URL encoded for me automatically. So I don't have to set up any headers or do anything other than setting up these parameters in the body. So if I go ahead and send that request, this is what I'm expecting back from Cherwell for my token. So the key things that we're going to use here are the actual token value, which we would set, we would store in a stored value in Cherwell. The token type is a bearer type. And the last piece that I use is the expires in. And this is a numeric value based in seconds. So it's basically 1200 seconds, which is 20 minutes, which is our 20-minute timeout for our token. So we're going to use, I'll show you later into Cherwell how we use each of these pieces. For testing in Postman, I really only need that bearer token, right? So all I have to do really here to test is just grab this guy and then copy it. And then under the authorization tab, I can select bearer token and then just copy and paste my value into there and hit send. And the endpoint I'm using here is the API v1 get teams. And so it gives me back my expected result, which is a list of all the team IDs and the team names, and whether there was any errors. So that's really, it's very simple tool to use. I like it. I can add, from here I can add in further tabs to do further operations if I want to do posts or other get operations. And it's nice to get it all set up here and before going into actually Cherwell and configuring your steps in your web services to run through your testing at this point so you know everything works and you can see that you're getting back the expected values. So that said, let's go into Cherwell now and start looking at how we're going to actually utilize this in a practical application. So let's go back out here for a second. So what we're doing in Cherwell is we want to have, let's say, managers or supervisors that want to be able to maintain who's in the team, what team members are in there. And right now with Cherwell, you basically have to go through the security tab in the admin tool where you can look at your teams and you can see your list of teams here, and then you can add team members to them. But this, of course, requires someone with an admin rights to go in and add members to the different teams, right? So it would be nice if we could do that within the Blue client or within our regular CSM client and allow other users to be able to do those changes. So this is a great practical use of the API because we can use that for this purpose. So I have a search here that gives me back all of my teams, all my user teams here. So I can just pick whoever I want here. Let's say I want to add somebody to building managers, for example. So I can see who's here now. And if I want to add a new member, I've got some buttons here that I've added in that are going to actually interact with the API. So first of all, it's going to prompt me and ask me to pick somebody from my list here. So let's just pick Josh Wilson, for example. So it's going out now, it's authenticating with the API, and it's making the call to save this user to the team. And we can see we get back our success. And you'll notice that Josh was added to the list below, and I just had it do a refresh so that you could see that they are added to the grid. And the same idea, let's say I wanted to remove him now, I can click on remove and it'll say, you sure you want to remove Josh? And I'll say, yeah, sure, why not? And again, we go out to the API, and I remember Scott showed you there was a get, a post, and a delete type method. So in this case, we're doing a delete method on the API to remove Josh from that team. So that's basically the idea behind this, and it makes it way more flexible and easier for you to maintain your teams. So let's go back to the admin client and see how we actually accomplish this. Okay. So Scott already ran through setting up the REST API client ID with you, and you want to set up a user account. So what I like to do first thing is I like to set up some stored values that I'm going to use for this purpose to set up my authentication parameters and also to store my token when it comes back. So the first thing I have is the API URL. So I've got my base URL set up in here. So this is going to allow me to that when I change to different environments, I can just go in and update this stored value for production or whichever environment we're in, and then it'll take care of connecting. These two stored values I have, the token and the expiration, are going to be set after I authenticate, and I'll show you that in the one-step operation when we get into that, how these are actually being utilized. And then the other three here, client ID, password, and username, are going to store the actual client ID, which was set in the REST API. And we can't access that through a system function or anything, which is why we're having to use the stored value. That's the reason why we have that. And again, with the username and password, I'm not able to pull those out, so I have to put them in stored values so that I can access them when I want to authenticate. So those are really the key stored values that we need to set up. So we've got our client ID, we've got our user account, and we've got our stored values set up. So we're all set there. So now we can, we want to set up some web services to connect to the actual API. And we can do that in a couple of places. Under the browser mobile, there is Web Services Manager, or if you prefer, you can create a blueprint and access it through there as well. I'll just show you through the Web Services Manager right now how we can connect. So we have one set up here already that's called Loopback API. So the URL, we need to set the base URL for our API calls. And that is why we have the stored value in here. So we can set this, and now when I adapt to different environments, it's going to automatically update the URL accordingly, right? The service type is REST. Security is none because we're going to be doing our own authentication with the calls, so we don't need to set up anything in here. And I usually always have these selected to call from the server, and to also log any calls that are made just in case we need to do any troubleshooting. And then the second piece is to set up all of our methods. These are going to be all the calls that we're going to be making in one steps to pull or to set data through the API. So our first step in the process is to authenticate, right? So I just called it login. We'll jump into the login. So you can see when I was back here, I'll just jump back in here to Postman again. So you'll see I've got this endpoint here with the token in it. So we need to set up the exact same endpoint in Cherwell. So in the endpoint piece, which is optional, in this case, all we have to put is token, because it takes the base URL and adds whatever we've got in endpoint to the end. So you can see it shows us below here, so we know that we've got the right URL, which is great, just to make sure you didn't make any mistakes. It's JSON is going to be what our result's going to come back, and we're going to actually do a post here because we're going to send that URL encoded body. So first thing we need to do is set up some parameters. So our first parameter is a header, and it's going to be the content type. And as you remember back here, we look at the header, you'll see the content type here is application form URL encoded. So we're going to be doing the same operation within Cherwell to tell it that. So we need to set up a parameter so that we can set this in our one step. And then we just need the body, and the body's just going to have the actual JSON information in there, or in this case, the URL encoded information. And it's important to make sure you have the checkbox that this is content, as opposed to we're adding a parameter to the header or to the URL. This is actual body of our message. So that's really all we have to do there to get that one set up. And then I'll show you the next one, which is the save team member. So when we're adding a team member, so we have our endpoint here, which is important. And you can see below that it's added that onto our base URL. In this case, I'm just using the V1. I could use V2 if it's available as well. But in most cases, I find the V2 is just basically added something into the schema of the response, and it doesn't really affect the operation of it at all. So in this case, I'm just sticking with the V1, but it's totally up to you. Again, a JSON post. And you'll notice that we have the content type header again, and we also have the body, same as the last one. But we also have this other key one, and this is the most important one, is our authorization header. So again, it's a type header, and this is where we're going to actually put our bearer token in that we get back from our login call. So that's going to get set in there. And I'll just show you one more here, the get teams, just so you can see the difference here. This is a get operation. So we have a little bit bigger endpoint, and you'll notice that at the end we have what we call an endpoint parameter inside of curly braces. Okay, so we're going to actually be passing in the user's record ID here, which will be a GUID, saying that we want to get all the teams that this particular user has. So again, we would have set up the authorization header, the content type, and then this endpoint parameter, which is our user record ID. So and it's important that this name matches exactly with the value that you've put here in the URL, or else you'll get an error. So that's basically what we need to do. There's one more for removing it, but that sets up our web services. So now we got our web services, we're all set, we're good to go. So now let's start using it, right? So in order to do that, we need to create a blueprint, of course. So let's take a look at the team info form. And you'll remember we had form here with these 3 buttons at the bottom here, right, which I've added in for doing the actual functionality with and connecting with the API. So let's jump into this one here to add a new member. So our one step is to add a new member here. Okay. So if you remember, the first step we had when we went to add the new member was we needed to prompt for an actual user. So we have a prompt set up here to give us a listing of all the different users from the user info, and then they basically just pick that one and we grab the record ID from that. So now we've added in some extra, basically some checks and validation. First of all, did they actually select a user? So we need to check to see if the user is empty. Then we want to check to see if maybe this user is already a member of that team. So obviously we don't want to re-add them. They were already there. So we have a check for that too. And then our default decision is to go ahead and add this user now to that team. So let's say everything is passes and we're going to go down and go ahead and add this person to the team. So the first thing we need to do is, because we're doing the save operation, we need to set up the JSON body, because we're going to send a request with that body in it. And we need to specify the team that we're adding them to and the actual user themselves. So you can see we have here this JSON body, which is just a name value pair. We have our team ID, because we're already selected, we're on the team form, we know which team we're adding to, and then the variable gives us the actual record ID that we obtained from that prompt. So now we've got everything set up there. So the first thing we want to do is we want to authenticate with the API. And what we're using here is we're actually using an action block. And I don't know how familiar everybody is with action blocks. So I wanted to jump into the action block and show you how that's set up. But this is a great application for an action block. The action block allows you to reuse this code over and over in different one steps without having to re-implement the code again. So it's like a subroutine, I guess. It's reusability, and this particular operation is excellent for that. It allows you to have parameters that could be passed in and out of the action block. And in this case, we're going to have the actual token. We have a flag here called force, which I'll explain in a minute. And then we also have when is this token going to expire? So we have the expiration, right? So if I want to actually jump into that action block, edit that guy. So we have our parameters, token, force, and the expiration. So the force is just a logical value, which allows us to say, hey, I want to force the authentication. I don't care whether the token's expired or not. I just want to do it. So it does give you the ability to do that. That's completely optional. You don't have to have that in there. It's just something that I added into it. So the first thing you want to do then is to check, are we forcing it, or has the token expired? Is really our two conditions when we want to actually go out and do a re-authentication. So we're checking for that, and then we're checking our actual values here. So if we jump into this, so we're getting the current date and time, and we're seeing is that greater than our expiration date. So here's our token expiration, and that's the stored value that I had showed you previously. So if it is, then we have an expired token. We want to go ahead and do it. If not, I'll just show you the exit one first. All we're going to do is we're going to take those those existing values, and we're going to update them with the stored values here. So these parameters will get updated with the stored values, and that'll get passed back into the one step that we were just in. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and set up our request here. And again, this is the same as what I was showing you in Postman, where we have our grant type, client ID, user, password, and then our authentication mode is internal. So, and these are all the values, the stored values here that I had showed you earlier that we had set up. So it makes it real easy to set up this value here. So then we go and make the actual call to the API here. And we can store the result in, these are basically local variables that it's going to store it in. So we can get our result, which will be JSON, and then we'll get our return code, which will hopefully be a 200 value, or it will be some 400 value if there's an error. So the method that we're calling here, it shows us all the different methods that we set up for the web service. The login is the one that we want to do here. And this is the content type parameter that we set up for the header. So as I showed you in Postman, this is the header that it's added in. So we have to add that header as well. And then the body is just this body, the variable that I had set up here with all our parameters in it. So that's going to submit it. And then we're just going to check, did we get back a 200 code or not? If we did, we're going to go ahead and set these variables. We're going to set the stored value. And for the stored value token, we need to set the type, and we want to set the actual token. So this is the JSON that's come back to us, and we're going to grab the token type here. I'll just quickly jump back here. So this is what came back to us, is this JSON here. So first thing we're going to grab is the token type, which is the bearer. So we're going to grab back this token type, and so it'll put bearer here, and then the second part is the actual token itself, which is the access token. And you'll see again, that's the access token here. So that's all we're doing there, grabbing those values. We're setting our stored value. The expired in value is going to take this number here, which was expired in, which again was the number of seconds. And what we like to do is just subtract a number like 300 here, so that that gives us time to a little buffer there to make sure that we're grabbing a new token beforehand. So that's what we're doing there. So we set up our expiration, and we exit out and back to our one step. And so in our one step, we just check to make sure we got a token back. That variable should have a token value in it. If we did, then we're going to go ahead and add the new member now. And again, you can set up your results and your return codes. We're going to do the save member. So here's our authorization header, which is the key one. And we're just going to take that value from the variable and stuff it in there. It's just an application/JSON is the content type. And then the body is our variable that we set up back here. We set up this call value. This is going to actually do the work for us of adding it. So then we're going to look for a 200. It's going to be, in this case, we can use 200%, 2%. So we know it's going to be 200 to 204, somewhere in there. Then we know we were successful. Otherwise, there was an error, and in this case, I would just have a pop-up that would show me that an error occurred and give them the results. So on success, I'm just going to do a refresh and reload so that you can see that the new member has been added to the grid. And then at the end, we had that pop-up to show you that it was a success. So that's really the full operation there on doing that. That's basically what I wanted to cover on that. And I think at this point, I can turn it back to you, Scott.
Excellent, Greg, thanks. really like that example. It's one of my favorites on how to use the API interactively within Cherwell. Shows you a totally different way that you can utilize some of the things that we normally do as administrators. So I am gonna flip over to my screen here and get that brought up. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing my rich client here. Okay.
Yep.
So we're going to wrap up with the webhooks piece. I'm going to go through and show you how you utilize the webhooks, how we set them up, just a real quick introduction to webhooks, and then we'll talk about why you'd use webhooks and APIs and stuff a little bit to give you an idea as to when you'd want to leverage those. So I'm going to give you a very quick demo that I'd set up here. I was working with a customer a while ago, and basically when they were hand creating customer records, they wanted to be able to run a PowerShell script that would go set up their AD account, set them up with some security groups, figure out their UPN and their SAM account name, get those set up, and then shove some data back into Cherwell. So we had their object GUID ID and we had their SAM account name pushed back into the Cherwell record. So I've just got a stripped down version of that I'm going to show you. And we used webhooks to do the work on their trusted agent and then push the data back into Cherwell using the webhook to get it back. As an example, instead of having to write an API interface to shove it back, because the webhooks were just a lot less effort to make it happen. So here's what would go on. They would pop in, they'd create the record, and they click the one step. And I've got this paused up here for just a second so you can see kind of what the results of the call are. I got a 200 and I got a lot of extra data about that. Had I got an error, there would be a lot more description in there. I only have that popped up for us for the demo so you can kind of see what that result set looks like. And when that's done, the webhook pushed back into Cherwell their network ID here. So that's the general scenario of what we're doing. Now I'm going to show you how we did it. Super simple. You're really going to like this. First thing we need to do is go into the admin tool into security. There's a couple layers that we have to set up here. And the first thing we need to do is go into security groups for the anonymous browser and get over to business rights. And we have to make sure that here at the bottom, webhooks, you have view rights. If you don't, you're going to get a 500 error when you try to hit it. Next thing you need to do is go over to browser and mobile, and we've already gone through the REST API URL at the beginning. You'll have to make sure that's already configured. Once you've done that, come over here to browser and mobile and hit the Webhooks Manager, which you can also do in a blueprint, by the way. I've pre-configured my endpoint so that my one step would work in the demo there for you. You can have multiple endpoints, give it a name. And there are a couple provider types. Amazon and Slack have specific custom pre-built authentication methods that Cherwell has hard-coded into the application. Everything else is going to use other, and it's just basic username and password authentication. And then you get an endpoint extension. This is where you get to set your custom endpoint, which is basically the last part of the URL. If you look right here, you'll see my full endpoint. You'll see the API base right here. And then Cherwell for all webhooks adds this webhooks part and then slash whatever I put up here. And you'll see as I type, it's changing my endpoint down here. So this is my custom endpoint. And each endpoint extension that you create must be unique so that every URL is distinct. You can hit the copy button here to add it to the clipboard so you can put it out in your code. And then, let's see. One thing to mention for webhooks, you'll have to make one for each culture. So if you're doing different cultures, create a different endpoint for each culture. When it comes to authentication methods, I get a couple choices. I can do none, which is anonymous, which in this case I'm doing it. I'm just calling and sending data to Cherwell and letting it do its thing. Or I can do basic with a fixed username and password. These are not in the user table. They only exist right here within this one webhook that I'm setting up. If I create another webhook entry, it has to have its own username and password entry. And we'll just cancel the changes when we get out of this one. And then the action, what are we gonna do? Well, webhooks only do one thing. They run a one-step. So the idea with a webhook is that the webhook essentially is a web address on the web server that's just listed. It's an operator. So when your external application, whether that be Cherwell calling itself or say the Azure Graph API calling back from a result or anything else calling in, it's just there listening. You make a call into the webhook URL, Cherwell answers, you authenticate if it's set, you send your JSON or URL data package, and you hang up. And Cherwell either gives you a success or a failure. That's it. Once Cherwell has accepted that data, it gets an entry put into the MQ, the message queue, and it waits for a handling thread to pick it up and work it. So that can be a bit of a delay, up to about 90 seconds or so before it fires. And what it does is it runs your one step. And then here's the culture that it's done. So I'm going to show you my one step real quick, so you can kind of see how I built this one. And the first thing I want to point out is if I made the one step from the webhook, it's automatically going to have the webhook variables available to it. If I was just doing it directly through the one-step manager, I'll have to go in and turn on the webhooks variables. I'm going to show you how you do that here. While you're on the first block of the one-step, pop over to conditions. And down here where you show custom tokens, like if I was doing email for the email monitor, I do that, but for webhooks, you're gonna make sure that the webhook is enabled so that it can show the webhook custom tokens within this one step. All right. And so this is just a super pared down one step here. And this is, for this one, it's what am I gonna do when I get the data that comes into Cherwell? When the data comes in, I'm sending a JSON package in, so I have to tell Cherwell that the data that I'm getting here is JSON. And so the first thing I do is I right click over here, and up here under webhook content, there's one variable, and that's just the body. That's that JSON or XML package that came in. It's stored in the body variable. So to get stuff out of it, I have a couple choices. I could create a variable that's JSON type. Come on, stay there. That's JSON, and then manipulate that later. Or if I want to just extract a piece of it, like I'm doing here, I can just say that I'm going to use it as JSON and then grab the attribute that I want and throw it into my variable. And so I've just grabbed those attributes and thrown them over here for me. And I, from my external system, I'm also passing over the record ID for the customer that I want to jump to. So I just pop over the customer and then I update their customer record with the SAM account name that we pulled in from that JSON package, which is right here. So that's just the update. I could do anything. I could jump over to a release and say I'd used a package builder externally. When it gets done, maybe it passes in the network share for the files that were just built for my project build and maybe the success of it, or and then it changes the status of that release. I can do anything in a one step that I want once I've got the data. The next thing you have here is you have the test button. And so at this point, I will show you, I built a real simple JSON package where I'm going to go ahead and update Tyrell's record. So I just paste that in here. So this is the JSON package that I'm expecting to receive. This is an example of it. And when I hit run, it's going to go ahead and run the one step. Critical. It is actually running the one step and changing data. So whatever your one step is, when you hit the run button here, it's doing it live. And so it's telling me that my one step ran successfully. So at least I've troubleshot my one step and I'm good to go. But remember that it will change data if that's what your one step does. All right. And so if I come back over to Tyrell, he now has a network ID because I just shoved it into him. All right. So that's getting data in. Now, I told you you've got to set up the REST API URL. You've got to set up your webhook endpoint, and you've got to set up the security group. The last thing that you have to do is come into the Cherwell Server Manager to the Cherwell Service Host and configure it to turn on System Event Processing Service. This is off by default, whether it's a new install or an upgrade. So if you've got a system that's hosted, you'll have to call support and ask them to turn this on for you. Enable that piece of the service, otherwise your webhooks will fail. So that is the last piece to get webhooks working. All right, so how do I call a webhook? How do I push stuff in? Give you a real quick example on that, super simple. So that one step that I had on the customer record here on the header, I'll just show you what that one step looks like. Picked the wrong form. Here we go. And give it a chance to draw. There we go. This one step is super pared down. I just put the skeleton on it just to show how you'd actually do the webhook call. So what I'm doing is I'm running PowerShell. So I have my script here, and I'll just pop this up so you can see what it looks like. This is my entire script. Nothing down there below. So key critical points. Here's my endpoint URL. So when we were creating the webhook and I showed you that customer username and I could edit the change, that was that endpoint URL, and it's right here. So this is what I have to be able to call my webhook that I set up that's going to run my one step. And then I just have some data I was pulling in from the customer record. And then I create a JSON array. And since I'm in PowerShell, I'm basically just creating a variable and then converting it over to JSON. So that's just housekeeping. And here's the actual call. So that's it, just a single line to send that piece of data. And what I'm doing is I'm invoking a web request. When you saw the stuff that Greg was doing, when he was doing the web calls, he was actually invoking a REST method, which is calling a REST API. I'm running a web request, which is how I'm connecting to the webhook. You could use and invoke REST method, but the difference is if I do a web request, when it gives me back my 200, my 400, my 500, the body of that message you saw on the blue screen that popped up, all of that text, I'm only going to get that if I do a web request so that I get a full response back. And I do that so that if it fails and I can capture the error message, it gives me more detail and helps me troubleshoot it better. And then it's just a matter of what am I doing? Since it's a webhook, the only thing you can do with a webhook is send it data. So that is a post, and they are always a post. It's the only option available. And then you have to tell it, am I sending you JSON or am I sending you XML? When we configured the webhook, we told it what type of data to accept. I had it on JSON. You could have flipped it over to XML then, and then your body parameter that comes in as the webhook variable would then be an XML package instead, and you'd have to use the modifier accordingly. And then what is my body? What's the data, which is that JSON package, which was the stuff right here that I'm sending over. All right. And then the URL, which we got up here. That's it. And then I just had it post the response. So real simple. Where am I going? What am I sending? And then make the call. And then just so you can see it, this is how I called it. I'm running PowerShell. I'm having the execution policy bypass happen, and I have no profile because I'm running this potentially on the automation server, so it's not running as a user, so I have to have no profile, and then I'm just running that script file that I wrote to a temporary file. And as a note, I made sure that it was plain text and that it was written before the next substep happened so that it was already temporarily written. And just in case you've not done a file, what I had done is I came up here and said that I wanted to have a new file name. And I put a custom extension of PS1 on it so that I could kick it off so that it would run as a PowerShell script. And that is, in a nutshell, how you get the webhooks enabled and available and how you call them and then how they function. All right. So let's talk use case for just a quick minute. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, so I'm a little bit over, so I'll be real quick. The main difference between webhooks and APIs are, do you need synchronous or asynchronous operation? So asynchronous, like in this case, I'm doing something in another system. I'm just firing data blindly to Cherwell, and Cherwell can go do its thing whenever it needs. No big deal. I'm not time dependent or sequence dependent. Just sending it to Cherwell, fire and forget, I move on. Perfect way to use a webhook, super lightweight, very, very little effort to establish. I don't have to go through and grab a bearer token. I don't have to go ahead and set up my session. I don't have to worry about watching the timeout or any of that. It's just fire and forget it. But again, it's one way, and Cherwell's not pushing back out telling me, hey, the one step that the webhook is running finished. It's just a blind call. I've delivered the message, that's it. The other side's the API, and that is, I want it to be synchronous. I'm like when Greg was running his one step to add somebody to the team, the one step did its stuff. It fired the API call, it took action, it got a response back, and then his one step could continue and it could process the results, decide which direction to go within the branch in the one step, do more things, quit, whatever. It was synchronous. It waited until the API action was done, and he was able to deal with the results. He got something back from Cherwell. Those are the two main differentiators between the webhooks and the API. And the API is very, very powerful. A ton of really cool stuff you can do. So I hope, I'm going to flip over to my PowerPoint here real quick, because that is pretty much the end of the demo piece. I hope you guys got something out of that. And if we went too fast, remember, you can rewind, see what we did. And we have some resources that we used, and here are the URLs for those resources. Those will also be sent out to people who, you guys who are registered for the webinar. And do you have any questions? We're gonna go ahead and open it up. Take any questions you have, and we can take a little bit of time, whatever you want.
Yeah, so like I said earlier in the presentation is, yeah, we are over the hour, but we're going to stay on to answer some questions. So if you have them, go ahead and put them in now. I just want to thank Scott and Greg for presenting today. And in the meantime, I'd like to invite you all to our Quest for Collaboration. This is a weekly meeting that we saw a need for in 2020. And if you've attended a Cherwell user group before, it is very similar, as in there is no sales information included. We bring together our Cherwell customers, friends, and acquaintances for an hour once a week to discuss problems and challenges as a group, and we share knowledge and solve those issues together. You can sign up and join us when you can on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern if you just head to our website, excaliburdata.com, and then under the resources tab, upcoming events. And so we did have a few questions come in. I'm not sure, Scott, if you can see those, if you pop them out. The first one might be a little bit easier for you to read. It was during the very beginning of your piece.
Let's see. Okay, so what I've got is that SAM account name PowerShell script running from the local user's machine or from the server? Okay, excellent question. In my example, I ran it as myself and it was running on my local machine. The way that I built it for the customer though was that when the user would click the button that they want to have it happen, we would flip a flag and the automation process would watch for that flag to be flipped, and then it would run the PowerShell script. And so in that case, it ran on the server and it ran in the security context of the service account that the trusted agent was running under, because we were doing it on a trusted agent. And we had clicked on the PowerShell block, we told it to run it on the trusted agent. If you're on-prem, you'd skip that point and just have the PowerShell run locally on your main server. And in that case, it would run under the security account of the Cherwell microservice. That's the only question I am seeing. I'm sure that I'm...
There's one at the top. Is there any way to specify a key value, such as if we refresh our dev or QA, if we have separate keys in those environments that interact with other systems, QA and dev systems, do we have to regenerate or have other teams redo their keys?
Okay, So when you're setting up the key, let me just pop back over there real quick because it'll make sense. When you're in here, and you're setting up the, let's see, yeah, it's gonna kill on me. When you're setting up the REST API and you're setting up that key for the client ID, that static specific to that environment and that REST API endpoint that you set up. And so if I understood the question right, when you go from environment to environment, you can't move the key. So when I set it up in dev, I've got a dev key. When I go set it up in QA, I get a QA key. When I set up in prod, I get a prod key, and they're read only. And so when I start refreshing my lower environments, then whatever I've got in prod, that client key is now going to be in my QA database and then in my dev database, and there's nothing I can do about that. Those are static. So they are going to have to update their client IDs in those systems. So one thing you could do is before you start doing a really large build out is go make the API settings in prod and refresh your lower environments before you start a major project. And then at that point, you know that the client ID is identical across all of your environments, barring going directly into SQL and hand editing it.
Awesome, thank you. I just wanted to add for Greg, Jason said to +1 for using Postman, so he wanted to add that in there.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
And then he also said, so this looks like a perfect way to avoid writing PowerShell script output to a log file and then pulling that back into the one step. Does that sound correct of what was going on?
Yeah, so you don't have to, are you talking about Scott's example or just the API?
Yeah, Scott's example.
Oh, okay. Maybe Scott wants to say more about that.
Yeah, so if I'm running a PowerShell script on the trusted agent, and I don't want to try to dump it to a file and then push it. Normally, if you're running on the trusted agent, you can't read the file back in. So you've got to use the API or the webhook to push the data. And a lot of times, if I'm just sending data back, I'll use the webhooks because it's a lot lower lift than using the API. If I'm running interactively, though, on the trusted agent, then I will go ahead and when my PowerShell is finishing, I'll capture the data that I need, and within that same PowerShell, I'll use the API to push it back. If you are just getting the data back through the webhook, remember that the webhook could fire, a minute, 2 minutes after your PowerShell is done. So you have to make sure that that data coming back from the webhook, you're not time dependent. So you don't need synchronous operation. You just need the data back to do something with. So hopefully that answers that question.
Awesome. So that looks like the end of our questions today. Was there any final comments, Scott and Greg, that you'd like to add before we close out?
No, I don't think so. That covered it.
Yeah, I think we pretty much hit everything. If you guys end up having other questions, definitely reach out. We'd be happy to answer them. And when Tabitha was talking about the quest for collaboration, if you're interested and you're unsure, please show up. It's totally acceptable just to arrive, hang out, and just be a wallflower and see how things go, and just kind of observe. We have a ton of interactions. They're really active. We've got a ton of people that show up every week, and we have really great technical discussions covering problems that people have that we help solve and questions and things they're trying to do. So super useful brainstorming sessions and problem solving.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for hanging out with us for an hour and 15 minutes today, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.